The air in the apostolic palace was heavy, thick with an unspoken weight that seemed to cling to the ancient walls. It was late, far past the hour when the Vatican's corridors usually fell silent. A faint glow from the candles flickered across the room, casting shadows that danced like restless spirits. Pope Francis sat in his simple wooden chair, his frail hands folded in his lap, his eyes fixed on the small crucifix hanging on the wall. The world outside was oblivious, but inside this room, time itself seemed to hold its breath. He was dying. The doctors had been clear, their voices trembling as they delivered the news earlier that day. His heart, weakened by years of tireless service, was failing. There were no miracles left in medicine, they said. Only hours remained. Yet, there was no fear in his eyes. Instead, there was a quiet resolve, a spark of something unspoken, as if he carried a secret too heavy for the world to bear. Sister Clara, a young nun who had served in the Pope's household for only a year, stood by the door, her hands clasped tightly to keep them from shaking. She had been summoned unexpectedly, told only that the Holy Father had asked for her. Why her? She was nobody, a girl from a small village in Sicily, unremarkable in every way, but his request had been firm, and now she stood there, watching him, waiting for words that might never come. Clara, he said suddenly, his voice soft but steady, cutting through the silence like a blade. She flinched, startled, and stepped forward, her heart pounding. Come closer, child. She obeyed, her footsteps echoing faintly on the stone floor. As she approached, she saw his face more clearly in the candlelight. His skin was pale, almost translucent, but his eyes, those eyes that had looked upon millions with love and sorrow, were alive, burning with an intensity that made her breath catch. Sit, he said, gesturing to a small stool beside him. She hesitated, then lowered herself onto it, her hands trembling in her lap. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze locking onto hers. Do you know why I called you here? She shook her head, her voice failing her. The weight of his presence was overwhelming, like standing before a storm that could sweep you away. Because you listen, he said, a faint smile touching his lips. And tonight, I need someone to listen. Not to judge, not to question, but to carry what I cannot take. With me. Her throat tightened. Holy Father, I'm not worthy. None of us are, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But God chooses the humble to carry the heaviest burdens. Will you listen, Clara? She nodded, tears stinging her eyes. She didn't understand. Not yet. But she felt the gravity of his words, as if they were carving themselves into her soul. He leaned back, his breathing shallow but steady, and began to speak. There is a story I have never told, he said. Not to my confessor, not to my closest advisors, not even to God in my prayers. It is a story of a boy, a mistake, and a promise that has haunted me for 70 years. Clara's heart skipped a beat. A story? From the Pope himself? She leaned forward, hanging on his every word, as if the world outside had ceased to exist. I was 16, he began, his voice steady but laced with a pain that seemed to rise from the depths of his being. My name was Jorge then, just a boy in Buenos Aires, full of dreams and sins, like any other. My family was poor, but we were happy. My father worked long hours, my mother prayed for us every night, but there was someone else. A girl. Her name was Anna. He paused, his eyes drifting to the crucifix, as if seeking permission to continue. Clara held her breath, the name Anna echoing in her mind like a forbidden secret. Anna was my first love, he said, his voice breaking slightly. She was 17, with eyes like the sky after a storm. We met at a church dance of all places. I was clumsy, awkward, but she laughed at my jokes, and that was enough. For months we were inseparable. We would meet by the river, talk for hours, dream of a future that seemed so close, so possible. Clara's mind raced. The Pope, in love? It was unthinkable, yet his words were so raw, so human, that she could almost see the young Jorge, his heart alight with a passion he could barely contain. But I was reckless, he continued, his voice growing heavier. I thought I knew everything. One night, we argued. It was foolish. A stupid disagreement about nothing. Where we would go, what we would do. I was angry, prideful. I told her I didn't need her, that I could live without her. She cried, begged me to stay, but I walked away. I thought I'd see her the next day, that we'd laugh and make up, like always. He stopped, his hands clenching, into fists. The room seemed to grow colder, the shadows deeper. Clara's stomach twisted, sensing the weight of what was coming. I never saw her again, he said, his voice barely audible. That night, Anna went home alone. It was late. The streets were dark. A man, a stranger, followed her. They found her body the next morning near the river. She had been violated. Murdered, Clara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Tears welled in her eyes, but she couldn't look away from him. His face was a mask of anguish, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. I didn't know until the next day, he said, his voice trembling. I ran to her house, but it was too late. Her mother was screaming, her father was broken, and I stood there, useless, knowing it was my fault. If I hadn't left her, if I hadn't been so proud, she would still be alive. Clara's heart ached, the pain in his words cutting through her like a knife. She wanted to speak, to comfort him, but she couldn't find the words. All she could do was listen, as he had asked. I made a promise that day, he said, his voice steadier now, but laced with a resolve that sent chills down her spine. I knelt by the river, where her blood still stained the ground, and I swore to God that I would dedicate my life to him, that I would carry her memory, her pain, and use it to serve others. That's why I became a priest, Clara. Not out of faith, not at first, but out of guilt. The confession hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and unshakable. Clara's mind reeled. The Pope, the man who had inspired millions, who had walked among the poor and the broken, had been driven by a secret so dark, so personal, that it seemed to redefine everything she thought she knew about him. But that's not the end of the story, he said, his voice taking on a new urgency. There's something else, something I've carried all these years, something I've never dared to speak aloud. Clara leaned closer, her heart pounding. The room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in as his words pulled her deeper into his world. Anna's killer was never found, he said, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her shiver. The police searched, but the trail went cold. Years passed, and I thought I'd never know. But then, decades later, when I was a bishop, I received a letter. Clara's breath caught. A letter? Her mind raced with possibilities, each one more chilling than the last. It was anonymous, he continued, his voice low and deliberate. No name, no return address. But the words, I'll never forget them. It said, I know what happened. To Anna. I was there. Forgive me. Clara's eyes widened, her pulse racing. Who sent it? She whispered, unable to stop herself. He shook his head, a bitter smile touching his lips. I never found out. I tried, Clara. I hired investigators. I searched through records. But it was like chasing a ghost. The letter was written on plain paper, mailed from a small town in Argentina. No fingerprints, no clues. But those words, they burned into me. Whoever wrote it knew something, maybe everything. And they were asking for my forgiveness. Clara's mind spun. A killer, confessing after all those years? Or someone else, someone who had seen something, who had kept silent until guilt drove them to speak? The mystery was unbearable, and yet the Pope's voice held her captive, drawing her deeper into the story. I carried that letter with me, he said, his voice softening. For years, I kept it in my Bible, hidden where no one would find it. Every night I would read it, searching for answers, for peace, but there was none. Only questions, and the weight of my own failure. He paused, his breathing growing more labored. Clara noticed the way his hands trembled, the way his shoulders seemed to sag under an invisible burden. Time was running out, and yet he pressed on, as if determined to finish what he had started. "But there's one more thing," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Something I've never told anyone, not even God. Something that haunts me even now, as I sit here waiting for death." Clara's heart stopped. What could be heavier than what he had already shared? What secret could be so profound, so devastating, that even the Pope himself had kept it locked away? He leaned forward, his eyes boring into hers, and spoke words that would change everything. "I think I know who killed her," he said, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and certainty. "And I think I've known all along." Clara's blood ran cold. The room seemed to spin, the candlelight flickering as if the very air had been sucked out. She wanted to ask, to demand answers, but her voice was gone, stolen by the weight of his confession. "It was someone close to me," he said, his voice breaking. "Someone I loved. Someone I trusted. I saw it in their eyes the day after Anna died. The guilt, the fear. I didn't want to believe it, so I buried it, deep inside, where it couldn't hurt me. But it never left. It's been there all these years, whispering to me, accusing me." Clara's tears spilled over, her heart breaking for the man before her. The Pope, the holiest of men, was confessing a doubt so human, so raw, that it seemed to strip away the myth and leave only the man, Jorge, the boy who had loved and lost, who had carried a wound that never healed. "Who was it?" she whispered, her voice shaking. "Who do you think it was?" He closed his eyes, a single tear slipping down his cheek. "My brother," he said, the words barely audible. "My older brother, Luis." Clara's heart shattered. His brother? The betrayal, the pain, the impossibility of it all. It was too much to bear. She wanted to reach out, to touch his hand, to tell him it wasn't true, but she couldn't move, couldn't speak. "I never confronted him," he said, his voice hollow. "I couldn't. He was my brother, my family. I told myself I was wrong, that it was grief playing tricks on me. But the letter, it brought it all back. The way Luis looked at me that day, the way he avoided my eyes, the way he left Buenos Aires a month later and never came back. I think he did it, Clara. And I think he wrote that letter, asking for my forgiveness, knowing I could never give it." The silence that followed was deafening. Clara's mind raced, piecing together the fragments of his story, each one more heartbreaking than the last. The Pope, a man of God, had lived his life in the shadow of a crime he could neither prove nor forgive. And now, on the edge of death, he was unburdening himself to her, a nobody, a girl who could do nothing but listen. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why now?" He opened his eyes, and for the first time, she saw peace in them, a quiet acceptance that seemed to light the room. "Because I'm tired, Clara," he said. "Tired of carrying it, alone. And because I believe God sent you here tonight to hear me. Not to judge, not to fix, but to remember." She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "But what do I do with this? It's too much, Holy Father. I can't." "You can," he said, his voice firm. "You will. Keep this story in your heart. Let it guide you, as it has guided me. And when the time comes, when you're ready, share it. Not for me, but for Anna. For all the Annas of the world, who deserve to be remembered." Clara sobbed, her hands covering her face. The weight of his words was crushing. Yet there was a strange strength in them, a call to something greater than herself. She didn't understand it, not fully, but she felt it, deep in her soul. He reached out, his trembling hand resting on hers. "Promise me, Clara," he said, his voice fading. "Promise me you'll remember." "I promise," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I promise." He smiled, a faint, weary smile, and leaned back in his chair. His breathing slowed, his eyes drifting to the crucifix once more. The room was silent, save for the soft crackle of the candles and the faint ticking of a distant clock. And then, he spoke again, his voice so soft she almost missed it. "Anna," he whispered, as if calling to someone far away. "I'm coming." Clara's heart stopped. She watched, frozen, as his chest rose and fell one last time. His eyes closed, his hand slipped from hers, and the light in the room seemed to dim, as if the world itself had felt his passing. Pope Francis was gone. Clara sat there motionless, her tears falling silently onto the stone floor. The story, the secret, the promise. It was hers now, a burden and a gift she could never escape. She didn't know what to do, not yet, but she knew one thing. She would keep her promise. She would remember. And somewhere, in the quiet of eternity, a boy named Jorge and a girl named Anna were together again, their story finally at peace.